try one more time.
I think if you would like to speak, you should raise your hand if you can.
All right.
And then I don't know if they'll address please.
We're good. Okay, so what we're gonna do is apologize for that. I'm sorry. Secondly, we're going to call in order people with their hands up to speak. So the first on the list is Barbara, and each speaker will have 2 minutes. Please start by stating your name and town of residence. So
Okay.
Barbara, you can begin speaking.
Yes, Barbara Felitti from Huntington. Can you hear me?
We can. The louder the better, though, that you speak.
Okay. I support a regulated limited season for coyote hunting that does not include hounding, that recognizes the important role coyotes play in our ecosystem, and is based on sound science and the principle that wildlife should only be killed for a legitimate purpose. Commissioner Herrick talks about the need to dial it down a bit with respect to conflicting viewpoints on wildlife management. I agree. Public comment is one way for this to happen, but it's not just a matter of listening to public comment. It is a matter of acting on comments and shaping subsequent policy or regulation. So I ask, what is your goal in accepting public comment? Do you really want to consider alternative viewpoints to craft better policy and regulation? Or is this just a requirement to be ticked off as done so you can tell my elected officials you listened to the public? When I provide comment and the comment does not change the board or department's position and no explanation is provided, how do you think I feel? I can tell you, I feel ignored and dismissed, and none of us likes to feel that way. And it does nothing to dial down the temperature. In fact, it is one of the root causes of raising it. By not responding to all public comment in a meaningful way, the board and the department are raising the temperature. The Fish and Wildlife Board and the Fish and Wildlife Department hold wildlife in trust for the people of Vermont, all of the people of Vermont. Your job is not to represent your personal opinions, but to use science and the public values represented to you through these comments to make decisions on policies and regulations. If you choose to ignore the science and public opinion presented to you, you owe it to the public to make a clear statement about how you came to your decision. But I hope that instead you will consider all comments, even those you disagree with, and find a balanced approach forward. Thank you.
Here, here.
Barbara, if you could please mute yourself.
Yes.
Next on the list is Walter. Walter, you can start by stating your name and town, and then we'll begin the 2 minutes.
No way we can have more volume.
Good evening. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Is it coming out of his laptop or the TV?
It's coming out of the Samsung device. This is at full volume from what I understand, but I'll keep putting it up.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, Walter.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Walter Medwood. I'm from Derby, Vermont in the Northeast Kingdom. And I want to thank you, Allison, for all you've been doing to try to get the train back on the tracks and make sure the public has an opportunity to have their voice heard. I also want to thank the commissioner for his encouragement in getting this polarizing issue before the board. You have before you a petition that is grounded in science and rational thinking to address the current public policy you have approved. That policy can be summed up as the only good coyote is a dead coyote. The petition before you seeks to normalize our existence with coyotes, not demonize what is now a Vermont species, like it or not. No different than the opossum, no different than the black vulture. Species extend their range, species retract their range. It's simply a natural process that has been so badly misinterpreted and little understood. Who is served by the current policy? The standing of the department and the board have been eroded by such public policy. The North American model of wildlife conservation has been thrown under the bus by your current policy. The largest block of Vermonters who identify as mutualists, that is, they want to coexist with wildlife, not dominate wildlife, are not represented by your policy. The standing of hunting has been tarnished by your public policy of killing for the sake of killing. The public policy of demonizing our apex predator is an affront to every ecological standard known to science. It is an
That's
affront.
2 minutes. If you could wrap it up, please, that's 2 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll finish with this. We are at a tipping point, and this issue is at the nice edge of the tipping point. It's my sense that this vote will be the most consequential vote you will take, perhaps the most consequential vote any board member has taken in terms of charting the future of Vermont's wildlife governance.
Okay,
As
we're gonna
Dave
move on
Fielding-
To be fair,
Thank you very much.
Jane, you're next. Please make sure to unmute yourself.
I'm Jane Fitzwilliam from Westminster, West Vermont, and the VCCC lead, Vermont Coyote Coalition. According to Fish and Wildlife's website, coyotes are important members of the ecosystem. Conservation of the coyote is important to maintaining ecosystem integrity because of the vital role they play as predators. Yet, the board allows killing coyotes 365 days a year, day and night. This relentless persecution, even during mating and pup rearing season, is in violation of one key principle of the North American model of wildlife conservation. Wildlife can only be killed for a legitimate purpose. The department has institutional bias favoring deer over coyotes, even though the Fish and Wildlife Department website states coyotes have no long-term impact on these populations. FWD's opposition to 3 recent Senate wildlife bills demonstrates their allegiance to an entrenched, biased agenda. This bias is perceived by a subculture to treat coyotes as vermin versus important members of the ecosystem, quote unquote. You can see this played out by the many photos posted online by hunters who've beaten a coyote puppy to death, chased another into an icy hole and shot point blank, and another who strung up dead puppies by their hind legs on a utility pole. In a normal world, this is considered deranged. The board should reinforce science-based policy and not fan the flames of unwarranted hatred towards coyotes. The board can do better by following the science and not the politics. We ask the board, please treat coyotes in the same manner as other Vermont fur bearers and not accept the bias of the department's management, which has shown an extreme bias against predators and for having politics as important an influence as science. It's only fair. Establish a season on our coyotes as important members of Vermont's ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Next I have, because phone numbers can't raise their hand, I'm gonna say a phone number and ask if you'd like to speak. So phone number 802-917-4132. Would you like to speak? So if I don't hear from you or no one else raises their hand, we're going to be done with the public comment period after Harry. Harry will be next. So you can go now.
Hi, thank you so much for all of this coordinating. My name is Harry Crown. I live in Hyde Park, and I speak in support of a ban on open coyote hunting season and establishing a regulated season with mandatory reporting that is scientifically based and ecologically sound in the very least. I'm proud to live in Vermont because of the way that we so bravely move forward in creating policy that uplifts and acknowledges our reverence for the natural world. Whether it's Act 250 with its profound effects that we see every day living here, or the newly passed Act 146, which in another 30 or 50 years will provide mature forest land, the likes of which none of us see in this state now. When we look at these awe-inspiring examples of policy change in the same hand as our current allowances for the open hunting season on coyotes, I'm filled with great confusion, dismay, and in all honesty, disgust. On the one hand, we have created a structure to support and uplift our natural world, whereas on the other, we allow a vital member of our community to incur harm and neglect. I am ashamed of this allowance because it is rooted in irrationality, fear, and domination. The efforts that we make as a community to become more sustainable in terms of solar panels, plastic straws, or composting are for naught if we do not take into account the intrinsic role that coyotes play and the inherent right to life that they have. This is what the science shows. I believe that each and every day we take a step closer to living in closer alignment with each other, human and more than human, and healing the wounds from the wanton waste of wildlife that stems from colonization. By banning open hunting season on coyotes and implementing a science-based, ecologically sound, and regulated hunting season, we take real action towards creating a sustainable future for all communities in Vermont. I am so excited to see the ripple effects for when this legislation passes. Thank you.
Next, it looks like Brian, you'd like to speak?
You calling me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to type in a message. I own a rather large woodlot in southern Bennington County. I have no regrets for who I am, welcoming coyote houndsmen, coyote trappers, and all fur trappers. I welcome Vermont bear hounders to my property. Lately, with the issues of several individuals in Groton who interfered with legal taking of wildlife, I am going to request all hunters and trappers on my land to have the game warden's speed dial telephone number handy. And I'd like to know what, if there's a game warden present at the meeting. I thought I saw one. Could he comment on this? And I'm going coyote hunting. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Now I'll ask one more time, the telephone number 802-917-4132. Would you like to speak?
Yes, this is Hale Irwin.
Okay, you have 2 minutes. Please state your town of residence also.
Middlesex, Vermont. And I just want to support the controlled season on coyotes. The wanton waste and the thrill killing of coyotes is completely unethical and not appropriate. And everybody else has spoken well, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a Jade Pace who would like to speak?
Yes. My name is Jean Pace, and I live in Manchester Center. And I'm very pleased to hear these very well-spoken people supporting a controlled hunt on coyotes. I don't know much about the science, but I know that the science is very important. It's critical. I know that it's what the board depends on to make its decisions. And it doesn't seem like there's any credible evidence that indiscriminate killing of coyotes effectively offers any benefit to wildlife management. It's just a matter of doing your job, please, please. We don't have a whole lot of time. I hope my granddaughter will grow up in Vermont and enjoy the wildlife diversity that we now enjoy, at least. Don't upset things, please, please work with wildlife. Their lives are probably going to have a great effect on us, especially over the next 75 to 100 years. Let's not upset the balance. Thank you very much.
I don't think there are any other people virtually who want to speak based on the hands raised and the phone number. I think company. What's that?
She's on the board.
She's the board member?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody who's presented their comments. I think that's the end of the comment period. One thing I would like to clarify is there seems to be clearly a misunderstanding on what we were going to address tonight as a board relative to the Coyote petition that you have all referenced. And this is, I think my memory fails me here, please, other board members jump in and correct me. But in the April meeting, we took up the petition that was presented to us by, I think, Chris Shadler. That name is correct. And we as a board took action on that petition. Because of everything that was going on in the legislative process, there were many bills, many balls up in the air, and we weren't sure what was going to go on. We took an action to take the petition and forward it to the Department of Fish and Wildlife to review, take all the bills that were up in the air and that ultimately would become passed, and come back to us with a recommendation sometimes in the future when everything was known. And so since then, bills have passed, bills have not, it's just died, and we are where we are. What we also asked the Fish and Wildlife Department to do was to come back to us on an interim basis to keep us updated on the progress that they were making in terms of coming to an ultimate recommendation to the board on how we should act on the petition and the bills that were passed. So tonight on our agenda, we have Coyote petition and hunting management update that relates to those bills and that petition. In terms, the department's going to give us an update on where they are in that process. We aren't taking action tonight because we don't believe they're making a presentation to us requesting an action on behalf of the board. We are just going to get an update on where the department is. So that's what that line item said. There seems to have been a big misunderstanding on what that is. So we apologize for that if it wasn't clear enough. But that's what our board's intention is to get that update tonight. So I just want to throw that out there so that everyone's aware. I keep hearing a lot of comments about a misleading agenda. Absolutely not misleading whatsoever. From the board's perspective, who understood that process, and if anybody saw that April meeting, that's kind of intuitive to that decision. So with that said, let's move on to the next item. That would be the petition. Is Robert Mullen? I am here. Robert, you're welcome. Robert's going to present us. We're going to brought 10 minutes to present the petition that he has forwarded to the board. And where do you want me? Right here? Yeah, stand. Yeah, why don't you come right up in the middle? We can all hear you. Or stand beside others on the online can see you. Okay. Where do you feel comfortable?
Yeah, where you feel.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's
right here, you'll be seen.
There you go. Okay. Well, I have been informed that pizza is here, so I will try to keep this very brief. The petition was written back in, let me see, the date in May. It pertains to the working group that we are now a part of. I did not know we were going to be invited to that when I wrote the petition. So it is not my intention to belabor the board with issues that may come up also out of that recommendations from the working groups. So it's just kind of like caught in between here. I'm not trying to create more work here. These all pertain to tracking issues. And I'm going to go through them very quickly. If you've had a chance to read them, there's not too much in here. One thing that struck me when I grew up in Vermont. I've been here I just spent 20 years away in New York City. But when I found out Vermont was around me, it just really hit me. I grew up hiking here. I was never a trapper, but I have had 2 near-drowning incidents myself. And to hear that it's allowed as a way to take animals was just really hit me.
I think something, now I know specific drowning sets, as I understand, are basically colony traps, and there's a slide lock mechanism you can have on a foothold. Like a beaver runs the water when it's in trouble. If it goes into the water and can't get back out, the slide keeps it down. Those are designed to drown. And I know when the otter season was extended in 2016, this is before quite a period of time on the border of the farm. Eric was here. But the commissioner at that time, one of his main rationales for extending the otter season was that they wouldn't have to offset the triggers and conibear traps. They're usually set right in the middle of the opening. They set them off to the sides of the otter and go through. The bigger beaver still hits it. But because it was off to the side, the beaver wouldn't hit it quite as quickly. And sometimes it wouldn't get caught by the neck, it get caught by, further down the body. And the commissioner said they would then drown, which was inhumane. I'll go back to this. I do think drowning is an inhumane way to take in. And we have two, at least that I know of, I'm not a trapping expert, but two types of traps that are specific in drowning an animal. That's what they're designed to do. So I thought if you wanted to do something that isn't attacking a broad attack on trapping itself, I mean, beavers drown sometimes in conibear, but they're not designed to do that. You could make that kind of a carve out. If you eliminate drowning sets, it would, I think, be a wonderful move. And by the way, wasn't clear. I am the chair of the Vermont Wildlife Coalition, who do broadly support hunting. We don't support open seasons, but I'm going to belabor you guys more comment there. Restoring the exclusion of traps within 10 feet of beaver-like entrances. This was something when I was involved in a trapping incident up in Bolton, Vermont. I was told by fur bear biologists at the department that trapping targeted the adolescent beaver in a pond, the ones that were going to be dispersing, the 2-year-olds dispersed. And they're the ones who can, even in a pond like the one we were talking about at the time, well, no problem with anybody, found mostly on our property and the town forest. So it wasn't, any kind of infrastructure problem, no issues like that. But they say, well, you have dispersing beavers, which cause problems elsewhere. And this trapping focuses on the dispersing beavers, the juveniles, because they're less experienced. And that's because you couldn't put a trap within 10 feet of the live entrance. Fair chase, providing the juveniles, all that sort of thing. And then I read, much to my slight surprise, in the Fur Bearer newsletter 2018, actually a rather celebratory tone to it of how they've gotten that exclusion eliminated. I would simply ask you to restore it. I think it just makes good sense. And the last thing is back to where I sort of started, between the otter season to February 28th. The website, I don't know if it still does, but they point out the otters breeding season does start in late February, early March. It can, and I understand that in Vermont it doesn't typically, but as climate is warming, that date is probably going to advance. If it made sense, then it probably makes sense now. The rationale given at the time to extend the season haven't borne out. I did bring this up to the board last year, I think it was. And again, do apologize for seeming to belabor the point, but the response from the department was, well, the otter population is not in trouble, which was relatively not really addressing the points I made. I was just saying, well, the otter season's okay, the population seems okay. Their otters have declined in the numbers that we've taken. Wildlife biology, I do have a degree in biology. One of the reasons that I considered going into wildlife biology, but horribly can't use a lot of what they call proxy data. You can't go out and census the otters in the state. Very, very difficult to do, and I appreciate the difficult job that wildlife biologists have. But there is a lot of doubt involved, and erring on the side of caution, it might be a good idea to just not be pushing into what might possibly start becoming more commonly the breeding season for otters. And again, it's only a matter of setting the offset on the trigger off. It's 2 seconds, and the thing slides very easily. It's not a huge burden on a trapper to have to offset the trigger. And I think I've fulfilled my promise to keep it short. Any questions? I'll have to try to deal with.
Any questions from the board? David?
So those proposals in here, you feel will be dealt with by the working group?
They are within the jurisdiction of the working group, but they may not get past the working group. So but obviously that's the board's
Some of
decision.
the big jurisdiction.
Yeah, but it's totally the board's decision what they want to do with it at this point. I do realize there's some potential overlap there.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, and as we have in the past, I will now ask the commissioner to say a few words about the petition and just some thoughts, and then at the board, we can figure out talk about what we want to do next for next steps.
Thanks for the petition. Thanks for coming in, presenting it as well. I'll be great. I would recommend that the board accept the petition and push it to the department to come back with a recommendation regarding it, whether it gets taken up at the working group or otherwise. We will look at the scope of it, but I think the general kind of the motion from the board to accept it would be my recommendation. I don't know if Mark wants to add to that, but that's my recommendation.
Perfect, thank you.
I like that motion.
Okay, I have a motion on the floor from Brian to forward the petition onto the Department of Fish and Wildlife to kind of roll into the whole discussion that's currently taking place around fracking and so on.
That was my question, Mr. Chairman. I did not hear that as part of the motion, but if it is, then I'm in support of the motion.
Brian, is that correct? Okay. Do I have a second on that? David, you second that? I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. Any other comments?
So the motion is just your department consider this in the working group.
Well, if it may be part of the working group, it may not. I think it may be worthy of its own discussion. And there's some time constraints around it, but we'll work and figure out which is best. But wasn't my recommendation that it be mandated to go to that working group.
Right. I think the motion is to forward it to the department. And if the department chooses to use the working group to cover some of this discussion and it works out that way, then that's great. But if it's done separate and apart from the working group because the working group isn't covering that particular issue or recommendation, then it's really the department's responsibility not to work to it because what we're saying.
For clarification, what I meant is that I would make motion to accept the petition and forward it on to the department for the department.
Sure. Yep. And Dave, that's what you were saying, just to make sure.
Yeah, and I think it just changed in terms of the assurance I was given, because in fact, the commissioner just said it may not go on to the working group.
And that was my initial recommendation.
Right, and so,
I made a motion based on his original recommendation.
okay, so I withdraw my second. I do not support that motion. Because I really think, sorry, man, continue to go ahead. I really think that as part of the discussion here, I think it was, the expectation was that it would in fact go on to the working group. At least by the author of the petition, and hopefully I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I asked that question specifically.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask the commissioner a question? Is there anything in here that you see that may not fall under the current jurisdiction of the working group? That just isn't a natural fit for that working group based on its current charge?
Well, they did a big charge already, the working group does, with respect to what the legislation requires them to do. And so I was just thinking that it may not be worth putting more work on the working group. So the answer is not necessarily.
And just for clarification, because the term working group has been said so many times, can you give the quick 15-second explanation as to what the working group is working on?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was the legislation around trapping was created, and there were also other issues. And so it was my prerogative to set up a working group to bring a recommendation to the commissioner's office, which then I will bring to the board. And so they've been working, and there's gonna be an update in a little bit, and Mark has been working really hard with that group. And so it was to address the requirements of the legislation and other aspects that may come out. And so that is, and I just remind you, that's above and beyond what's required by legislation or any previously adopted legislation on the process. And so, but as a way to involve more folks in it, I created a working group, which is broadly representative. And so they've had one meeting so far. So that wasn't part of their initial charge.
Thank you for that. I was at your last meeting and just wanted a refresh, but also have everyone know in the room what working group. Thank you.
I do hesitate here. I know it's your meeting, but Representative Dean did reference what I would say, so I just wanted to maybe clarify that, if that's all right. These 3 points, I certainly probably will bring up in the working group. I'm on it, but it does work on a consensus and shy of a complete census of vote basis. I don't have power to say these will be part of what comes out of the working group. So whether they go through the board process or not is probably relatively independent of the working group in my estimate.
Okay, so any other comments? Where we stand right now, we have a motion still on the floor from Brian. David, you've withdrawn your second of that motion. So I have a motion on the floor. Second. I now have a second. Any other comments or any other? If not, okay, then why don't we I'll call roll call votes. All those in favor of the motion as presented by Brian and seconded by David, please signify by saying aye, and I will go through the list. Jamie Dragon Memorial. Jamie have a lead, I think it's 6. She's gone, okay. Robert Patterson, Addison.
Yes.
Yes. Michael Bancroft, Orange.
Yes.
Neil Hogan, Bennington.
Yes.
David Robillard, Orleans.
Yes.
Barney Van Buren, Rutland.
Yes.
Mike Holston, Essex.
Yes.
Brian Bailey, Washington.
Yeah.
Jay Sweeney, Franklin.
Yes.
David Dean, Wyndham.
No.
Brian McCarthy, Grand Isle.
Yeah.
Nicholas Burnham, Windsor.
Yes.
Chittenden County is vacant at this point, and myself, Caledonia, I will vote yes. So yes has it, the petition has been moved to the departments. After the recommendation. Thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda is the trapping EMP.
Is it time for a break for people?
Yes. Okay. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in, let's say, 40 minutes, 20 minutes. Why don't we come back at 6:35?
Okay, I leave the video recording, but I mute it, so.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
red flag. Probably black one.
You will miss something.
It didn't work out. I think people are going to attend it. But
Not this good.
I don't know what actually I'll be wrong, but
that's good.
see that. There'll be some.
Josh, I'm not really able to catch this.
Yeah.
First thing, but then recorded, but recording didn't even read the first time either.
Whoever was looking else she got like, you're a lot better. Really getting right up here. You know, kind of in an awkward fashion almost. Thank you. Good job. Okay, is everybody back? Okay, good. Then let's get back to business. The stated earlier, the next item on the agenda is trapping EMP updates. And I will turn it over to departments, to Commissioner. Take it from here.
Mark or Kim, who's gonna go first? Yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to Kim. Folks, Kim's virtually tuned in. If you can't hear it all, let us know. The whole key of this, and actually the next item on the agenda too, is just to keep the board informed, as your chair noted earlier, of the processes and the work that the department's doing to meet the demands before you. And those demands have come to the department and you in a way in terms of from legislature and from petitions that you've received or memos and information that the department has received in interest. So I was just thrilled that we finally got the first meeting going. It took a lot of time for us to get there, more than I anticipated, but I'd like to turn it over to Kim. Kim Ryder, I won't do a formal introduction. I think most of you know her from her previous work, but she's been put a lot of good time into this so far, and there's a lot more to date. So we thought it would be just a brief overview for you. I'm going to Kim do the speaking, and then we can answer any questions at all that you have. And we would be Kim, myself, or the commissioner. So Kim, I hope you could have heard me okay. And then it sounds like some of the board members were able to hear the presenters earlier virtually if you spoke close to your computer.
Okay. Can you,
I hear you now. Good.
can you hear me now? Can everybody hear me now?
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll try to speak as loudly as I can. So thank you all for having me. I'm here to present some information about the working group and where we are to date. As Mark said, we had our first working group meeting on August 4th. And that's the first of what we have assumed might be 3 meetings. We'll see where we are on the 3rd meeting. The next one is next week on August 23rd. And we have another one scheduled for September 8th. And we were happy with the attendance at the first meeting. We had around 13 people attend, representing a variety of interest groups, including people from the Vermont Trappers Association, the Sportsmen's Federation, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the Vermont Wildlife Coalition, HSUS, Protect Our Wildlife, 2 wardens, the legislature, and 2 board members, Martin Van Buren and Mike Coulson. And I would invite either one of them to actually throw any comments in or suggestions or things that they observed that I might miss. And thank you both for participating. So we actually started the group with some ground rules, which the members participated in generating, and we came to some kind of consensus, or at least around those. We talked about what the committee charge was, which was basically to make trapping more humane and ensure that the recommended regulations to the commissioner are enforceable and practical, and that they're within the parameters of Act 159, the Legislative Act 159. We went through what the decision-making process would be for the working group. And then the bulk of the meeting basically was taken up by a presentation from Bryant White, who was the author of the TWS, the Wildlife Society monograph on BMPs, and for the last 20 years has actually led the research effort on best management practices for trapping. He gave a presentation and also invited Dr. Dan Stone, who was one of the veterinarians that conducted the necropsies on the animals that were trapped, just to answer questions about injury scores and things like that. Their presentation was about 30 minutes, but there was about an hour's worth of questions, almost an hour's worth of questions and answers after the presentation, which was a little longer than we had anticipated in the agenda, but we opted to let that go on because it was such an opportunity to have Bryant and Dr. Grove there to answer the kinds of questions that people had. So then once we finished that, we broke up into two different groups, the blue group and the green group. And the charges of the two different groups were, we had three, well, actually two formal petitions and one letter that we gave to each one of the groups, all three. And they had three charges, one which was to determine what from those petitions fell within the jurisdiction of the committee charge and Act 159, to try to see if there was any consensus among the members of the group around any of those issues, and to generate questions that they might have for the department to answer at the next meeting. That took another hour for most of those folks. And so we never were able to get the working groups back together. We're hoping at this next meeting that we'll be able to break them out into again so that they'll have time to report back out again as to what results came out of their working groups. And then once we finalize the minutes, which we'll also do at the next meeting, we'll make sure they get distributed to all the board members. And we've already distributed a draft to the working group members, and we're now sort of working on making any edits to those minutes based on what their perceptions were. So I think that's Martin or Mike, do you have any other comments before I turn it back over to Mark?
I was really impressed with their presentation from the sense that it was a blind test and that they had a point system. The veterinarian had a point system that would bounce a trap based on injury or a very broad section of possibilities to that animal. And I think their cutoff point was 55.
Correct.
Basically, if it cut the skin or a bone was broken, that trap was out of the equation. The vet did not know what the trap was. They knew what was in front of them, and it really was a terrific piece of work, because that really convinced me that the BMP standards really were looking out for not wanting to cause any more stress to my animal than was necessary. So that was what I sort of took away from their presentation, and the fact that it was 30 years and $40 million, I think, at this point, that was spent.
Correct. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up because we did tape the presentation. So if anybody on the board is interested in viewing that, we're working on figuring out how to download that and send it out. And also, I believe Bryant is trying to put a PDF of that together so we can also send that out as well.
guys that did some traffic in Wisconsin there, I think they caught 41 bobcats, put GPS on, them, let them go afterwards. And that was really good because they thought some of these bobcats may be dying right away or something. And nothing was happening. So that was good to hear and see that. The whole presentation was great. So that's one of the best presentations. They had no injuries. They had lived a healthy life, it seems like. So.
Anybody have any questions? I will just mention the timeline, where we go from here. I think after the September 8th meeting, depending on where we are, we would probably, we'll report back to the board at every board meeting and just give you the same kind of update as to where we are. And then I think hopefully in October or November, we'll do a public meeting that will be in person and Zoom. And then once we do that public meeting, we'll make some recommendations to the commissioner and through the commissioner to the board. Probably we're looking maybe December-ish, optimistically. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, questions at all for Kim or the commissioner or myself. So if you look at your schedule going forward, you don't have a lot of regulatory business, but the intent of the department is to keep you updated on this process as we go, as we move along. And when we get that PDF, Kim, that'll be awesome if we can, because
yeah,
at least I hope you folks get to, everyone should really spend time looking through that presentation. And I know I learned an awful lot listening to it, and I intend to look at it again a few times more, not being a trapper myself.
I just have one comment. I mentioned to you earlier, Mark, but one thing that would be helpful for me would be that, and I don't know if this comes, where in the process this comes, but as you're coming up with the best practices and we're addressing, you know, both petitions that we've tabled in the past or that we've received in the past, and what bills, it would be nice to link them to which petitions specifically we're addressing. And so that we can kind of keep that link between the outcome here and the petitions that we've forwarded onto the department.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you hear that, Kim?
I did.
And,
Yes, thank
I think that was a good, we made a good faith, you did in the group, trying to do that the first meeting where two of the petitions were handed out and one of the letters that we got that we interpreted as a petition. And that was the first exercise. My sense is some folks came to, were able to come up with some good information, look at those petitions and where they felt, where others, we still got more work to do. The challenge for us will be to where do we go on information that is not based in good research and science, to be honest. So that'll be, we're probably going to have a lot more discussions on that, I assume, Kim.
Yeah.
And the one plus I will say is AFWA, which stands for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies throughout the country. They have delegated a person to be at every meeting, so that will help us a lot. If any organization is on top of this whole subject field, it's them. They've been, how many years have they been working on it, Kim?
I think 24 or 25.
Wow, okay. And I'll make it clear, the reason we brought Kim back out of retirement to do this, she is more qualified than any of us in the department to deal with this subject. It's been a major responsibility of her job. And you were also involved with some AFWA committees on trapping as well, right, Kim, and fur bear management?
Correct.
So way beyond the Vermont borders.
Good. Well, we appreciate you coming back out of retirement.
Who authorized it?
I don't know.
I didn't like retirement anyway. Not.
Well, I'm having no problems with it.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions for Kim or the department at this point? Okay, thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the Coyote petition and the hunting management updates. Again, I'll turn that over to the commissioner.
But I'm going to turn it over to the Colonel.
Great. Thank you, just talking on, can you share for the people that aren't here?
I'll put that in my email and I'll share my screen.
It should be at the top of yours. Did anyone not get this document when they came in tonight? I handed out a document titled Developing Regulations for Coyote, hunting coyote dogs.
Proposal for regulation.
Yeah. We're gonna share it a little bit online, so. So, Act 135 and S 281 culminated on June 1st of this year when the governor signed into law that language that is requiring the board to create a comprehensive rule on the taking of coyotes with hounds. I apologize for those who aren't familiar with me. I'm Jason Batchelder. I'm the Director of Enforcement. I don't present very often, so bear with me. I hope this will be more of a discussion. I'll try to be brief as well. But what I've got here before you, as you can see, it's my path forward, including a working group on creating this rule as best we can while following the parameters that have been set forth by the General Assembly. I've broken this out, and I'm not going to take any credit for this document. So Chris Saunders was instrumental in helping me create this. I don't know if Chris is on there tonight, but huge thanks to him and getting this into a format that is hopefully going to take us through rulemaking, starting as quickly as possible. But as you can see, the statute included language related to permitting and trespass. The board was directed to address several additional points, including dog pack size, legal method of take, and control of dogs. So the board's got its charge here, and as important as that is, the board also has had a bunch of this work done for it, which you'll see further on in the document, which are mostly under limitations, where the General Assembly has already put into place quite a bit of the language that are going to lead our path forward and dictate what we're going to be dealing with. But the working group itself, which I hope to convene in earnest within the next 2 weeks, they know who they are already, but I've yet to convene them and have them all on the same page. They're going to convene initially in the way of a survey, which we're almost done with. And that survey is going to lean heavily on, first of all, those 7 bullets that you see in front of you as ground rules. And then moving on to the charges, which are on the second page. I feel like I'm jumping around here a little bit, but when the rule is created, and I'll let you know, we have draft language in mind, but we're going to put almost the entirety of this to the working group in the form of a survey and how they would like these 6 charges to look before we put this rule in place, because we're fully understanding that we're here for a reason, and it's that reason is borne itself out in numerous negative ways around the experiences that average individuals, meaning people who don't file count on, have been affected on the landscape. And I'm hopeful that with the individuals that we have chosen, that we will come up with something that is workable for everyone. Let's see here. Maybe I'll just go down the list here and see if I can tease any questions out of the list here from working group charges. So the primary duties will be to provide input to the department during the development of the regulation, and then subsequently review the draft regulation prior to its submission to Commissioner Herrick. What they're going to be looking to do is come up with a limit on the number of dogs. We have parameters here created by the Bear Hound rule that we're probably going to follow initially.
Number 2 is going to be a prohibition on the substitution of any new dog for another dog during the pursuit. So that also follows a little bit of what bear hound hunters deal with now. A legal method of take for a coyote pursuit with dogs. So currently, there is nothing in statute or rule that specifies how a fur bearer may be killed. And there is consternation about these methods. And so we're going to clarify this through the working group. A definition of control that minimizes the likelihood that dogs will enter land that is posted against hunting or where the pursuit of a coyote with dogs is not authorized. This is going to be our biggest challenge, hands down, is to find a path forward for control of dogs. And we're going to spend a considerable amount of time working on it. We operate on the standard of reasonableness within the Warden Service. And so finding what's going to be reasonable to everyone is going to be a huge task. But I think we can do it. I think folks are going to be up for it. We're going to be all over the table, but it's you'll have to stand by to see what we come up with here. Number 5 is provisions to encourage persons pursuing coyote with the aid of dogs to seek landowner permission before entering or releasing dogs onto land that is not legally posted, and a reporting requirement for every coyote killed during the pursuit with the aid of dogs. Any questions from the board on any of those so far? Okay. There were additional considerations for the board, which included a season or seasonal restrictions and on baiting, and the survey and the board or the process for the stakeholders at large is going to include those. Something I had asked Mark to do earlier, and I remembered to do it myself, was to remind myself to let you all know that when we enter into rulemaking, as the General Assembly has ordered us to do, we're going to, in effect, we're going to be opening the trapping rule. It'll already be open. Excuse me, the fur bearer rule, right? And so all aspects of coyote handling will eventually be on the table through this process. And so many voices and stakeholders will be able to be heard beyond the scope of hunting coyotes with the aid of dogs. So season being one of them. Right? Season doesn't necessarily have to be specific to those who hunt with dogs. I know there are many individuals who have spoken here tonight, and I can't tell you how much everyone here appreciates the tone that was said here early on tonight. Me especially is the person who gets looked to for orders sometimes. Thank you very much for everyone's tone. It's been great. But moving on down the list, and you can read for yourselves. We will have let me get into the limitations real quick. So I guess the plain speak of this working group limitations is this working group is not an order as similar with the BMPs. We want this to be a process that we can look back and be proud of, and that we can go to the General Assembly and say that we all did a good professional job with. They will certainly be watching at every turn, and I know we'll get through it. As stated here, the commissioner has the final word on this regulation that is submitted to the board for consideration, and rulemaking through the Administrative Procedures Act includes legislative approvals, public notice, and public hearings. But I can't state enough about how I feel in selecting this working group. I feel that we're well represented. And I'm happy that I feel my computer open here. I'm happy to go down the list of individuals who have accepted to be on the working group. If anyone would like to hear that.
Let's see here. Can I ask for a clarification?
Sure, please.
Under the working group limitations, final bullet. The board regulations become effective if you prohibited to it. This is directed by the legislature. Point 2, to release a dog onto any land for the purposes of pursuing coyotes if in the previous 365 days a dog has been found on that land.
Mm-hmm.
It's so unclear to me. How do you understand that? Does that mean that's going to be the same dog? And how would a guy would know that some other dog had already been thrown up that man?
Sure, the way that this was designed to work was if, so these are gonna be permanent hounds, right? And that's a great question. So the way the bear hounds operate is they have 6 tags that we provide. They put them on their collars, and they put them on any 6 dogs that they want. Those collars are gonna rule the day when enforcement gets involved. And so if we show up and that hound hunter, we're gonna have to identify a collar that belongs to that hound hunter. And that's not a hard thing to do when we have such a small local population of hound hunters. So if a hound hunter is on land where they are not welcome and a game warden or other law enforcement officer tells them they're not welcome there, their name is taken down and recorded. And that is how that is going to proceed if they're caught there again.
So you mean, so maybe it should be reading release that dog?
That dog doesn't apply. The collars are interchangeable. So you can have 20 dogs at home and those 6 tags can only go on 6 dogs at one time. So it wouldn't necessarily be that dog at that time. It would be that collar and that hunter.
So is the violation one of those 6 dogs on that same property within?
It would be any dog that hunter chose to hunt with that day.
Okay, right.
Okay, so it is hunter specific. I was just
Hunter
wondering,
specific.
there's more than one pack of hounds. So,
Right. And we're gonna look into restricting that as well as the bear hound hunters exist under that restriction.
As a reminder, when the board just did the bear regulations back about 4 or 5 years ago, we put the onus on the holder of the bear permit. Not the assistants, not the people going out, not the dog, because it can get tricky. So that's the process, Jason. You're gonna try to look at that closely and work through the group. Because that was actually done to increase the enforcement tools for you folks, for people hunting bear with dogs. So.
Yeah, that was their own self-imposed restriction.
The Bear Hound Association won the petition us to do that. We worked with.
What else do we have for questions? I know I jumped around a lot, and the document is yours, and I know I didn't do a great job of presenting it. But my timeline is going to be an ambitious one for a lot of reasons. But we're more than hopeful to get the survey out to the stakeholder group on September 1st, or maybe even a little bit before. It's almost done. Sure.
Do you have any idea, once this is enacted, how many people we're talking about, how many permits are out there, how many people are actually running coyotes with hounds?
Well, it's an outstanding question, and I don't know the answer.
I can tell you that there's a limit of 100 permits in the statute. And to be frank, that was an estimate based on information from wardens and also a subset of the bear hound hunter number, which I think was 136 last year. So we took a much smaller number, but we may see a even smaller number apply for the permits down the road. And then just as a quick reminder, 10%, only 10% can be issued to out of state.
It's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. But if I can be as bold as to say the negative interactions we have are the ones we count, and I can't give you an accurate estimate. But if we reach 100, I'll give you a paycheck. I don't believe we're going to get to that.
Before September.
I won't be getting paid for much longer. Yeah. So as you can see, the timeline moves right along after we get the survey out. And I don't see any reason to hold it up. It's going to always follow the temperature of what we're able to get done within the department and here at the board, and the administrative process that Catherine can help us with. But I've left it open past December 25th, December 21st meeting in case things don't go so well. But at that meeting, we can regroup and talk about spring meetings and subsequent votes. But I can tell you that we're committed to getting the rule back open, but as importantly, we're committed to being proud of what we can say to the people who have been negatively affected and to the cow hunters who have been unregulated for 250 years of their existence, right? There's a lot of it to everybody. We need to get it right.
So can I just make sure I understand, when you say update the board to plan for spring meeting and subsequent votes? Where do we read that to mean that this rule won't be in effect probably until the spring?
You're correct. And I think that's even ambitious. I mean, the commissioner can speak more accurately, but I think that's a safe bet is we're looking at spring.
And that's what I've been telling people. Yeah, it could take longer than, this is not a fast process, nor do we want it to be.
Much rather see the details ironed out as smoothly as we can get them and not do this again.
Are we?
It's gonna be a tall task, for sure.
Are we tracking any data as far as impacts of not having hounding? As far as any conflicts or any hounders still doing it and not realizing it's banned for the moment?
The warden service is not tracking that. I can't speak for wildlife.
Oh, it's pretty challenging.
Yeah, but we do have the agricultural community represented very well on the working group. And I expect that we'll hear from them. But it's a good question. I know that there's sentiment out there wishing that we had it. Merely for the fact that a moratorium is a moratorium. So people aren't training, people aren't doing anything with their coyote hounds. And so many people are thinking, can I hold on to this asset for much longer and justify the expense when I can't use it? So I had heard that sentiment. So if that's not a tangible, measurable effect, but it is one that I've heard.
We won't be able to hunt until this is passed.
Yeah.
And this doesn't fall under the January timeline.
No, it's its own.
But there will be some intermingling of the rule, right? It's going to follow the same rule.
But I think, I don't know, Mike, you asked this question, but have there been any violations of people that are actually running hounds chasing coyotes right now?
No.
Gone into effect, the moratorium has,
I've asked for those and they haven't, nobody has seen.
nothing's happened.
It occurs in my area. It tends to be a winter activity, not a summer, not a fall. It tends to be snow.
I was surprised to know that some people do train, but I agree with it's certainly an abnormality to see it this time of the year.
David?
I have some questions about both of these working groups. And it goes to involvement of Fish and Wildlife Board members. First off, at some point in the process, I and everybody else have to vote to approve something before it makes it into the official APA process. Consequently, it is my contention to myself that I should be as fully informed about what is going on as I possibly can be within the limits, time, energy, intellect, whatever. In terms of the traffic working group, I just want to reiterate that I am not the board representative, but I intend to be at every meeting. I want every document. I want to be on the listserv for participants. And I will regulate my involvement with that. The same is true with this working group. I want documents, I want communications, I want meeting announcements. I am a board member of the Fish and Wildlife Board, and my name has to go on an action. Consequently, I have been, some of you know this about me. Well, I'm not going to use the word. I can be difficult. And it's about my name going on something and not being happy with it. So I'm reiterating what I believe said last time. I want to be plugged in. I want to be in the loop. I want to know what's going on. If there are restrictions relative to general broadcast and discussion of the items, please tell me. I can also be discreet. But in terms of my role on this board, I really do wish to participate, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so I'm trying to absorb all that right now. You can correct me if I'm wrong here. I think the Department of Fish and Wildlife has been tasked with coming up with a recommendation to the board. And through the legislative process. And so as part of the administrative branch of state government, that's how they are going to decide how they're going to do that. And I think it's my understanding that the commissioner has chosen to use a working group to do some of the boots on the ground work, to bring information up to him that will help him in his final recommendation to us as a board, of which we will then use for our rulemaking process. The commissioner has offered to invite a couple of members of the board to participate in that working group. And you two volunteers. And so at this point in the process, I think that's our role, is to help support that working group process by having representatives on that board. I think what you choose to do, I think as an individual, separate and apart from your role on the board at this point in the process, I'm trying to figure out whether or not I'm trying to figure out what you're asking is something to do with the board or something as an individual you're choosing to do. And so I'm not sure where that's
not sitting on this board, Mr. Chairman, I would not have an interest in.
No, I understand that. But
at the level I have.
Yeah, but I think every individual in this state can approach this process in terms of wanting to be in those meetings, and whether or not you have the authority to be in there as a civilian, as a non-board member, I'm not sure. I guess I'm just trying to understand at this point whether or not we're fulfilling our board role, our board role at this point by committing 2 members to that working group process, which is a very preliminary process step in this overall process. And we get more actively involved when the commissioner makes a recommendation to us. And at that point, we will have every opportunity in the world to ask every question and to make sure that we understand everything that went into that recommendation until we can't ask any more questions. I think that's when we have the opportunity to get there. Not today when they're doing their boots on the ground work. So that's my, I think, assessment of what our role is right now. But I think that's a little different than what you're saying. And your expectation.
It may in fact be. Does that in any way limit access to information that is shared with these committees?
I think the board, well, I don't know, we as a board haven't stated that we want to put those demands on the department. I think I'm hearing you as a board member maybe, or you as someone on, I think you as a board member asking that we put those demands on the department while they're in their working group process. Is that correct?
I don't believe I'm putting any demands on the department. Because if we're about to, move this discussion into, open meeting law. And whether or not in determining a public policy, citizens of the state have the right to, engage.
I don't disagree with that. But I think you're acting more as a citizen than a board. I think I think we've committed to our role that we've been asked to perform as a board by the department at this stage in the process. And I'm trying to understand if you are trying to attend those meetings and be part of every single discussion and access.
I didn't say I was going to be part of every single discussion.
Well,
I never opened my mouth at the first, tracking meeting.
No, I'm going off what you just said just a few minutes ago, in your complete access that you're asking for. I think that's, what I'm trying to figure out is you're taking that up as a member of the board, or if you're taking that up as a citizen of Vermont. I mean, I think we as a board are not asking for that level of information at this point. And we're giving the department the leeway to do what they need to do to put themselves in a position to make a recommendation to us. And at that point, I think the expectation is we will ask for as much information as we need to get to the point where we can make a decision on how we want to proceed with that rule.
Much like the BMP working group, are you just looking for any presentation presented to the group and meeting minutes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's easy.
And the survey is going out because, I mean, I didn't think I was asking for the sun and the moon.
So is that different than what we heard tonight? From from Kim and the two representatives who are on that committee? I misunderstood you. If you're not asking for anything different than what you got tonight, I apologize. I thought I heard something clearly different.
I did make comments on the draft minutes from the working groups from the first meeting based on my observation of the first meeting and reading those minutes. I had no expectation that anything would happen with that, but I wanted to share my observations, and I believe it was meant to be helpful, and I believe it was helpful. So,
maybe I misunderstood you. I'm sorry, Dave. If I misunderstood you, then I apologize. But if you were asking for minutes, the minutes and to be updated along the way, like we were tonight, then I think that is basically our expectation that we will get those. I thought you were asking for full access to the meetings, so you can participate in discussion, participate in the meetings. That's what I
would like to observe the meetings, yeah. And I would like to read the documents that are circulated at those meetings, just the way we're all going to see the presentation. But I thought it was kind of interesting. I'm not sure I agree with all the comments that were made about that presentation, but
then at this point, I think the working group
it was also helpful to hear the questions of those present and the additional information that they were looking for.
But at this point, I think the working group is a working group of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then I think we should have this discussion with the commissioner.
Okay.
If it's something more than what we received here at the meeting tonight, and something more than, getting a copy of the minutes.
Okay.
After the meeting.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Next item on the agenda.
Thank you, Carmen.
The next item is the air management overview. Thank you.
We're lucky enough to have with us tonight, Jackie. So I've spent some time within the field, and I know I've said this phrase probably every meeting I've ever been to since I've been commissioner, but I'm always overwhelmed with the expertise and the passion of the folks that work at the department. And I'm glad to say Jackie exemplifies that. And so we're pretty lucky to have her in the department and here tonight. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm going to jump in
I wasn't
here.
talking about you.
I know you were. Thank you for praising our new outstanding biologist that we've hired here, and not quite a full year under her belt. We'll be soon, right? Next month to do that. But anyway, I want to make it clear to the board why this is on the agenda, and thank you, Chair, for letting us discuss this and put this here. We don't have the luxury of coming before you with every single species that we manage. 58 different mammals, couple hundred birds and plants and reptiles and so forth. But this one, it was very apparent to me from some different communications that I've had with new board members that are here, as well as the moose and deer public hearings that we had. And bear questions, topics, opinions of people were coming up more than the deer questions that we had on analyst deer management, outside probably moose and ticks. This is what was on people's mind all over the board to do this. So I want to make it clear, is we're not coming here looking for a regulation change. We feel that the bear population is strong, it's healthy, it's abundant throughout Vermont. That doesn't mean that we've got full throttle on trying to manage that population. To do that, we just came out with a big game plan not very long ago that had lots of different stakeholder groups where we set some specific parameters and goals and strategies for bear management in the state of Vermont. So that's the point for tonight. It's really for your benefit. I apologize, especially to my staff. This is last on the agenda, but I felt this was an additional nice to know important topic where you had to get through the other regulatory information first on your agenda, because otherwise, and we can come back and answer more questions. I'm sure some come up tonight. So I really want to make that clear. And as I ask you, as you go through and hear the presentation tonight, the volume of data that our staff, both biological and warden services, collect on bear in the state of Vermont is phenomenal. And I can only sing the praises of internally. And I also got to sing the praises of our outreach staff, only because I'm aware of almost every day the number of emails and phone calls that we get on the topic of bear into this department. When I started the department in the early 1980s, it was deer and doe hunting, followed by coyotes. Right now, the number one topic that comes in our department is about bears. Many of those calls are people quite concerned about their livelihood, their children, their pets in their backyards, or the destruction that bear does. We're trying to track that the best we can. Is it perfect? No, but we're doing what we have with limited resources. I want to turn it over to staff, but I think it's important, especially given new board members, so you know the staff before you, not me, who is on the grounds, boots on the grounds, and doing the work to manage our bear population. First, want to introduce David Sawsville. Dave, you met through our waterfowl hearing meetings. He recently came over to take over our big game project and those species that are hunted. Dave got a Bachelor's of Science degree in 1989 from the University of Vermont. He worked for Ducks Unlimited for 3.5 years, worked for Virginia Fish and Game 3 years. He's worked in the department in 2000 to 2013 at the Dead Creek Waterfowl Management Area, which is a real key piece of real estate in the state of Vermont that all of you and anyone who participates in wildlife can be proud of in this state. And I am happy that I first got to know Dave. I think when you were a sophomore in college, if I remember right, the first year that I got involved taking over the Kehoe Conservation Camp. And where he's come in his career for a young Vermonter, born in Vermont, go through all this education and finally come back here and land a job and do it, and recently be promoted to supervise our game management. So I'm going to ask Dave to speak in a minute. Second person I want to allude to is on his left, Dr. Katie Geeter. Katie, some of the board members may have seen her presented when we looked at some trapping petitions about 2 years ago. Katie came to us as a faculty member at Humboldt State University. She has a PhD, a doctorate at Virginia Tech, studying climate change and piping plovers. She has a Master's of Science degree from Trent University, where she focused on shorebirds. She has a Bachelor's of Science at McGill University. She's worked on plovers, oyster catchers, climate change, Hawaii's flora, and wolffish, which I don't know what the heck a wolffish is, but I made that note years ago. But she's been with us since the summer of 2017. Her main job is to make sure that we do our science right. She's our conduit to the universities. She meets daily with the researchers at the University of Vermont. She's been a godsend to me on the moose management efforts that we've done. Because a few years ago, I almost thought we were out of the business, having to worry about how to manage moose. But thanks for being here tonight, Katie. And I know you are tightly involved with this project and many others that deal with our wildlife science. My staff collects no more data until they go through that gatekeeper right there. That's the bottom line. And then we're making sure that all of our data files that we have in state government talk to each other, which you think they would, but no, it's simple. Because I started the department writing notes and putting it in a hard file. That's what a lot of our staff did as biologists, not the modernization. And last but not least, Miss Jackie Como. Jackie started for us full-time about 3 years ago as a wildlife biologist in a position we call limited service position. It's not a permanent position, but at least she gets some benefits. She's been with the Bear Project since September of 21. She's been with the department since 2012. The track that most of our employees follow is it's almost a school of hard knocks where you've got to put a lot of time in as a seasonal and just hope you can feed yourself and find a place to live and eventually come on board as a full-time employee. Jackie was the principal researcher at our Deerfield Wind Black Bear study down in the southern part of the state. You're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, I hope, so that'd be great. She has a Master's of Science from the University of New Hampshire. She did her thesis actually back in 2012 on bear. So fitting that here she is working on bear. And her Bachelor's of Science degree was from the University of Maine and Orono, 2005. Go Black Bears. That's my alma mater. So we got to have some kind of, that's not what I hired. I didn't have anything to do with that. I just said, yes, hire that woman. She's done research on populations of bobcats, cougars, lynx, and marten in other states. So thank you for letting me take the time to expound on that. The staff, as I think the commissioners has noticed here in the last few months, is really top notch. And what I have learned through spending 4 decades with this department, people want to work here and they want to work for the Fish and Wildlife Department. They believe in the mission and they love the state of Vermont. They're not here as a personal crusade to fill their pocketbook or the piggy bank because it's state salary to do that. And sometimes I hear from them and I should. That's my job. So that's the point of tonight. And I think, Jackie, I'll leave it up to you how you want to handle questions as you go or through the presentation. So at your disposal. And first, I guess, David, do you want, I'm going to turn to you first. I'm sorry, Jackie. If you can just briefly, I'm sorry, kick in about the big game plan too. I think that's important because I'm getting a lot of different emails. People, I think there's a false public perception that we based our big game, our management strategies on bear due to one survey question that we asked the public quite a few years ago. So.
I was just here to mention it's online on the website. If you haven't seen it, you can download it, especially for the new board members. But the big game management plan is just signed off on in February of 2021, and it's good for 10 years. So it goes through 2030, and it covers moose, bear, deer, turkeys, and it covers everything from population objectives, habitat conservation, laws that are in effect, and the survey that they mentioned, they did do a survey several years ago about the public in general and what they felt. And like with bears, the majority, I think it was 65%, Jackie, somewhere in that realm, felt that bear population should stay where it is. And so, if you can get into depth, if you download it, sections page 29 to 35 is the bear section, and it's chapter 3 of that. So we just wanted to bring that to your attention as a resource for you to look at.
Thanks, David. David is Jackie's direct supervisor. Thanks. Thanks for being here tonight, too.
I can run that. Yeah. I always regret putting animations in if I like surplus.
All right, well, you guys have probably seen this before, but I always think it's kind of a good starting point to just go over Fish and Wildlife's mission, to kind of lay the broader context for the work we do. And so, of course, that is the conservation of Vermont's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for all the people of Vermont. It's a big, broad mission. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have a detailed conservation program for every species in Vermont, but bears are one of those species we prioritize. And that's because in Vermont, we treat bears like an umbrella species. And what this means is that we know bears need access to a variety of wetland habitats to find the foods that they need. They need access to what we call young forest habitats to find other foods that they rely on. And they need access to mature forests to find the foods they need. And of course, these things are not necessarily right next to each other on the landscape. So they also need connectivity or landscape connectivity in order to successfully find all of those foods. And so we know if we have a healthy bear population, it means we're doing a good job providing those habitats, providing that connected landscape for our bears. And of course, it means we're also providing those habitats for all the other species in Vermont that rely on them. So specifically, our department's bear program, we kind of look at it as like a four-pronged approach. Like I said, habitat is really the foundational part of our program. So, our department actively engages in purchasing and conserving lands for habitat. We review regulatory review projects, so big development projects for potential impacts to wildlife habitat. Specifically, bears are one of the species we do that for by looking at certain wetland habitat impacts and then hard mass stand impacts, which I'll talk about in a minute. We oversee the state bear hunting season, and so every bear that's harvested in the state, we collect biological data from those bears, and that data is what allows us to generate estimates of how many bears there are in Vermont, and we're able to track that trend over time, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute as well. We occasionally conduct research projects. So as Mark said, my previous role was overseeing a study we were doing in southern Vermont, looking at the impact of the Deerfield Wind Energy Project on black bear use of critical habitat. And honestly, most of the research that we have done in the state has been focused on that question, how human development impacts black bears' habitat needs. And then the ever-growing part of our bear program is our human-bear coexistence program, and working with Vermonters to help them kind of have the information they need and the behaviors they need to better coexist with our healthy bear population. And so I really think it's important to kind of understand how we're making our decisions within those four prongs of our conservation program for bears. For you all to just understand some basic facts about bears. And this is kind of what guides a lot of our decision-making process. So bears are a long-lived species. The oldest bear in Vermont was documented at 39 years of age. So they can live multiple decades. Yeah, go right ahead. They're also a relatively intelligent species. And so what I mean by that is they're good problem solvers, and they have been shown to have long memory. So they are capable of learning and retaining information. Their primary sense is their sense of smell. So that's how they're perceiving the world around them. Of course, they do have decent eyesight and hearing as well. And the key fact is that they are opportunistic omnivores. So they have a very flexible diet.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Their sense of smell, how does that compare to that of a dog?
Yeah, there's all these, stats out there, and I can never pull them off the top of my head, but it's far superior to, a bloodhound is usually the comparison that they make. And so I think that sometimes makes it hard for people because that is not our strongest sense, right? And so they are definitely interpreting the world around them differently than we do. So like I said, they are omnivores, and understanding their diet can get you a long ways towards understanding their behaviors. Here in Vermont, the majority of a bear's diet is dominated by plants. So they're eating vegetation directly, but they're really focused in on eating the fruits produced by plants. And so we break those down into two broad categories: soft mast, which are those soft fleshy fruits like raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, cherry, and then hard mast, which are the nuts. So acorns and beech nuts are the two most common ones here in Vermont, but of course hickory in certain parts of the state, and then other things like beech hazelnut opportunistically. They do predate on deer fawns and moose calves opportunistically, so they will eat meat. But research has shown that's really just a very narrow window in the spring when those guys are newborns and they're not very mobile yet. They will scavenge on carcasses, and then of course insects make up a huge part of their diet as well. And so like I said before, all these plants, they have their own set of conditions that they need to thrive. And so they're kind of growing only in their own specific habitat types. And so bears typically are relying on access to various types of wetlands, like this beaver meadow you can see here, to find some of those plants. They're looking for that young forest habitat, like I mentioned. So places with recent logging, places like power lines, where you can find a lot of those berry producing shrubs. And then, of course, mature forests are critical for them as well. And all those foods are typically only available during certain seasons. So as I said before, they're really navigating across the landscape and within their home range, looking for all those different habitat types. The hard mass is really the critical food for bears. So acorns and beech nuts really make up the bulk of their diet, a key time of year when they need to put on as much weight as possible. And research has shown that where bears have the option between beech nuts or acorns, the majority of bears are going to choose beech nuts over acorn. And that's because beech nuts are just a more calorie dense food. And if you've ever tried them, they taste a lot better than a red oak acorn. So our department is really focused on trying to maintain concentrations of mature beech on the landscape where we can. And how we do that is we're looking for what we call bear-scarred beech stands. So because beech has such thin bark, when bears climb up the trees and climb back down again, their claw marks will scar the bark of the tree. And so that creates an indicator for us. When we see concentrations of these scarred trees, we do what we can to try to maintain those through conservation. The cool thing about this relationship between bears and beech trees tend to be cyclical in their nut production. They tend to only produce nut crops every other year. Female bears tend to only give birth to cubs every other year. And research has shown that where beech nuts are an important food source for bears, they will synchronize their reproduction with the beech nut cycle. So the majority of females will give birth to cubs in the fall after a good beech nut crop. And so here are some examples of that at play. This is data that was collected from the Deerfield Wind study. I should mention that we're in the data analysis stage of that study. So data has been collected, and now Katie and I are just plowing through mountains and mountains of data. But it's really exciting stuff to see. And so here are just some kind of examples of what we're learning from that study. So on this map, this is an adult female bear. Those yellow locations represent the locations collected by her GPS collar. It's a little hard to make out on this map, but you can see these like black outlined polygons. Those are mapped bear-scarred beech concentrations. And then the pink triangles that you can kind of see on there, those were the proposed locations for the wind turbines. This data was all collected before those wind turbines were built. So on these maps, they're just kind of a hypothetical at that point. And so this is kind of a rough representation of what we consider her core home range. So this is where she spent the vast majority of her time, in this pretty tight little area in the towns of Searsburg and Reedsboro. And then if we zoom in on the fall of 2015, when we had good beech nut production in our study area, so you can see it's October 1st to November 15th, you can see her movements shrink right down to that big bear scarred beach concentration kind of at the center of her core home range. And so she spent the vast majority of that fall in that beach stand foraging on beach nuts.
Is that pinging the collar like twice a day?
Good question. So these collars are programmed with what's called a virtual fence, which is a little hard to see on the map, but there's a really faint red polygon there. When the collar was inside that polygon, it would collect a location every 20 minutes. And then outside of that polygon every 2 hours and 50 minutes. So that's like an adequate amount of data, but we wanted like really detailed data when they were in those beach stands and close to that wind facility. So.
That miles? How many miles?
Oh, her core home range, that's only like 3 to 4 square miles. It's not a very big area. And that's what you see a lot with adult females is that they usually stay in a pretty concentrated area when the food is good.
But she's not in there alone though.
No.
There are many others in there with her.
They are, and so bears are, in the carnivore order, but they are not like these territorial carnivores like what we think of with our bobcats and our coyotes. Bears do what we call resource sharing, and so they have a lot of overlap, and they have a system where they kind of know each other's dominant status and will take turns with access to high quality foods. So again, from our data, we can't tease out who's dominant and who's not, but we definitely have lots of bears with overlapping home ranges. And so here's another example. This is a different female. That last female's home range was basically like right here. And so now we're shifting south. Here's Bennington, here's Brattleboro, Harriman Reservoir, Somerset Reservoir, and then Mount Snow right there, just to give you some reference points. And Route 9 is that big yellow east-west road. This bear's home range was kind of right down on the Vermont-Massachusetts border in western Reedsboro around Cow Pond, if any of you are familiar with that area. In the fall of 2019, really good beech nut production. And this female bear did have a lot of beech in her home range, but not really big concentrations like I just showed you with that last female. They were more like in small pockets and then just scattered throughout the hardwood stands. She spent the first part of October just feeding within her core home range from those beech trees. And then in late October, she started making this movement outside of her core home range. She went up actually into the beech concentrations associated with the wind project. And by 2019, the wind facility was in operation. We don't know why she didn't stay there yet because we haven't crunched the numbers fully, but she visited one of those beech concentrations. And instead of staying, she chose to keep moving. She crossed Route 9, crossed over Glastonbury Mountain and up into the Live Oak Wilderness, kind of kept moving until she got to the south side of Stratton Mountain, where there are big concentrations of beech stands. She spent about a week and a half foraging there, and then basically like beelined it right back to her core home range to den for the winter. And so again, this is just like rough mapping as the crow flies, like maybe around 65 miles round trip. So pretty significant movement. Now, if we look at, this is that same bear, but the previous fall in 2018, and again, that blue polygon is outlining kind of that core home range of hers around Cow Pond. 2018, we saw terrible beech nut production in the study area. And in previous years, what we had seen is that most of the bears in our study area, if beech nuts weren't available, they would just drop south into Massachusetts, where the forest shift from beech dominant to oak dominant. And so most bears would just go to Mass and feed on acorns in those off-falls. But in 2018, the acorn crop pretty much failed in northwestern Massachusetts. And so she cruised through those oak stands, couldn't find acorns, and just kept on going until eventually she made it all the way to southwestern Massachusetts before she found plentiful enough acorns. And the cool thing about this movement is that she had dependent cubs with her at that time. So she was moving as a family group. And then similar to what I showed you with the last map, by the very end of October, she started beelining it back to her core home range. And over the course of just a couple days, was back in her home range. And within a couple days of getting back, entered her winter den with her cub. So these two movements by this individual female are a bit extreme. We didn't see bears moving like this every year. But I feel like these are great examples because it really highlights how important high quality foods are for these animals, especially during the fall. And it also really highlights the need for us to be thinking big picture when we're talking about landscape connectivity. Yeah, it's critical that these animals are able to safely move big distances to find the foods they need. And then that brings us to hibernation or winter denning. And you know, the primary reason for most bears to enter a den in the winter is because food is becoming too hard to find. And so this is a way of conserving energy. But of course, it's also for adult females when they're giving birth to their cubs. And so here in Vermont, bears are using all sorts of different types of denning structure. We will see them excavate out under the root system of trees that are partially tipped up or maybe growing over a rock like that big yellow birch. They're denning inside of cavity trees. They're denning under rocks, in rock holes, or they're just curling up at the base of a root wad like this bear right here, still exposed to the elements. But yeah, we don't fully get what motivates them to choose their dens. Some are definitely better than others. But this is an example of one of the best dens we saw through that study. This is an adult female, and this is a monster yellow birch cavity tree. This video is on loop, so it'll just start again. But she was denning inside this tree, way up high, and she had 3 cubs in there with her. And you can see it's a little hard because of the meeting box, but mid-April, you know, she was still tied to that den site because those cubs still weren't strong enough to leave the den with her. So she was coming out every day, eating snow, and then going back in until the cubs were big enough to leave with her.
Do they ever den in the same place 2 years running?
Pretty rare. I've heard from other biologists who have seen it, and I've heard from some biologists who have seen different bears reuse a den, but typically it's a different spot every year. And again, fortunately, you know, part of the motivation for sharing with you the different denning structures, or I like to share that with the public, is again, to keep in mind that structural diversity in our forests is important for bears for multiple reasons. Real quick, I'm going to go through kind of just like the rough life cycle for an adult bear. I'm going to talk about an adult female over the course of 2 years. So like I said, females give birth to their cubs in the den, usually anywhere from January to early February. Most litters are going to be 1 to 3 cubs, with 2 being most common. And so of course she's in this reduced physiological state while she's in the den, but those cubs are not. And, you know, so they're just kind of like any newborn mammal where they are just nursing and sleeping and growing, and just kind of nestled up to her to stay warm. But then typically here in Vermont, come mid-April, they're finally big enough and strong enough that the whole family group will leave the den, and she's going to start slowly moving them through her home range, looking for those key habitats that offer the different seasonally available foods. And they're going to do that for the spring and summer. Come fall, they're going to enter this physiological state that we call hyperphagia, which basically just means they become eating machines and they're trying to put on as many calories as possible. And through this whole process, you know, she's teaching them what is food, where is food, how do we find food under different conditions and in different habitat types. And then typically, depending on how good the fall foods are, they're going to enter a winter den as a family anywhere from late October to mid-November. This time the cubs will also enter that same hibernation state as the sow. And then the next spring, they all come out together again. They continue foraging. And then somewhere between spring and summer, the family group starts to break up, and we believe this is initiated by the sow coming back into estrus. So she's ready to breed again. Those cubs start to disperse. That can be a long process for the cubs. Female cubs will typically try to set up a home range adjacent to their mother or overlapping with their mother, whereas males are going to travel long distances away. And especially for those male bears, it could be a couple years before they're actually set up in their own home range. She's going to start breeding. These pictures here are again from that study. You can see the yellow ear tagged bigger bear in the bottom picture. That's the adult female with her 2 yearlings. And in the top picture, she's actually the smaller bear in that picture. And there she is with a mature male. Females can breed with multiple males and often will. So litters of cubs can have mixed paternity. Breeding typically peaks in like mid-June. And so the eggs will get fertilized, but then they go into this state of suspension and they don't actually implant in her uterus until November. And that's when they start actually developing into fetuses. And then, like I said, come January, February is when they'll be born. So then she gets to have that next fall to herself. She's on her own before entering a den again and starting the cycle all over again. So we'll kind of shift gears and talk about our bear population here in Vermont. Obviously, pre-European settlement, Vermont was dominated by forest, even more so than it is today. And so there was lots of great habitat for bears. You know, we don't really know how many bears we had in the state, but we can assume that they were distributed pretty much everywhere. European settlement removed most of the habitat for our bears. And again, you know, society back then kind of had unregulated persecution of animals that were in competition with us. And so our bear population became restricted to the remote parts of the mountains and remote parts of the Northeast Kingdom. Then, as our society shifted away from, you know, a really heavy agricultural-based economy, Vermont's landscape started to reforest. We started to see a lot of our species come back. And then groups like Fish and Wildlife Department, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, local land trusts, all these other groups kind of started really prioritizing habitat conservation and, you know, maintaining space for wildlife and people. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, our strategy to this is trying to maintain large connected forested blocks, prioritizing large forested blocks that provide those food sources that bears need. And like I said, we have a real focus on those bear spur beach concentrations. And then where we have influence over the management of some of these forest blocks, you know, trying to strategically implement harvest to promote areas with young forest habitat too, so that we still have that soft mat that the bears rely on as well. So in conjunction with this focus on habitat conservation, the society also started to shift towards understanding that we needed to have more regulations when it comes to how we're taking wildlife species. So historically, from 1831 to 1941, the Vermont legislature had a bounty for bears in Vermont. Our first bear biologist, Charlie Willey, reported that 1,295 of those bounty claims were paid. So that gives us a sense of how many bears were taken that were at least reported to someone. In the early 40s, we established our first bear hunting season from June 1st to December 31st. And then by 1955, we made it a requirement that any bear harvested in the state had to be reported. In 1961, we reduced that season to something more comparable to what we see today, but still not quite exactly the same, September 1 to November 30th. The trapping of bears was outlawed in 1967, and in 1968, we set a bag limit of 1 bear per hunter per season. In 1972, we established that a permit was required to hunt bears with dogs, and we outlawed the baiting of bears. In 1974, the season was reduced to September 15th, to the 9th day of the deer rifle season. And then in the 1980, we tweaked the season a little bit and lengthened it. In 82, we formalized the public process for setting population goals for our bear population. In 1990, we again reduced the season slightly. And then in 2013, we set up an early season tag for bears, which allowed us to start tracking, well, how many hunters are actually actively hunting bears besides just the bear dog hunters. Because before that, really, any deer hunter could opportunistically take a bear. We had no way of tracking what is the hunting pressure actually on our bear population. And then we also extended the season to what it is today, which is, again, that first day in September till the 9th day of the deer rifle season. And then in 2017, we made it mandatory for hunters to submit a tooth from every bear harvested, which, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is a really key part of the data that we need to estimate our bear population. And then we further refined the bear dog permits in that year as well. And so through that, all that habitat effort and the establishment of these regulations, you know, we saw our bear population climb, starting in the 1970s. And, you know, there's been variation over time, but in general, we've seen this pretty consistent growth, which peaked in the early 2000s. And then here over the last 10 years, we've seen what we consider a stable bear population fluctuating from around 4,500 bears to 6,500 bears, depending on the year. And of course, you can see there's some big swings within that range. But yeah, it's been what we consider relatively stable. And I'm just going to have Katie speak for a few minutes on how we come up with these numbers.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. I will try to be brief and simple with this model. However, I will say that it's probably one of the more complex models that our department has, just because of the nature of bears being a more long-lived species and generally a more complex species when it comes to analyzing data. So basically, the way that this model works is it's all based on harvest data, and it's called a change in ratio model. Basically, if we were to start with, like, let's just pretend we start with one population of bears, say there's like 100, and there's 50 males and 50 females. And say this is like your harvested population that I'm talking about. So you harvest 100 bears, you start with 50 females and you start with 50 males. As you go on through that cohort of bears into the future years, male bears are going to be, they are more vulnerable to harvest. And so that's the key to this model, is that as you follow this cohort through the years of it being harvested, it's going to start out with a lot of males being harvested. But as that cohort ages out, it's going to switch, change in ratio, to it being more, as the males are depleted from the population increasingly, younger males taken out of the population, then it's going to increasingly favor females being in that age cohort. And that's what the model really seeks to estimate, is that what is that rate of change in that cohort? What is the change in ratio of when does that stable, cohort of different ages of bears switch to being more favored to females? And so it uses, when teeth are submitted, what we end up with for any particular year is a whole cohort of teeth for that year from harvested bears, various ages of males and females. And all those teeth get submitted and they are aged in a lab using rings, growth rings on the teeth, similar to how you might see growth rings on trees. And so they're aged in that manner, and we get back those ages and then we put them into our systems it's basically like an age frequency. So it's counts of different ages of males and females. And then that gets put into our population model, which takes all subsequent years of data and kind of builds back the population that way. And in that way, it can estimate a harvest vulnerability from the change in ratio estimation that I just described. So basically, the measure that the population estimation is based on is this harvest vulnerability that comes from when you have more females that start to crop up in that age cohort. That's what it's estimated from. So you take that harvest vulnerability and you apply it to all your harvested bears, and then that's how you get an estimation of how many bears there are estimated in the population. And so because it's based on kind of following that age cohort throughout the years, it's really important to get a good sample of age data. And so if the years that Jackie has circled here are, well, it's not quite the year that we started requiring mandatory tooth submission, but if you look at these last 5 years here, so the last 5 points on there, what we have here is, so the black dots are like a mean estimate that the model outputs. The model will spit out what's a mean estimate of a population, and then what's a minimum and a maximum, what we call confidence interval. It's just a measure of confidence that the model has, that it could be anywhere from this estimate to this estimate. So that's the lines that cross those dots. So this is a minimum estimate, and that's a maximum estimate, and that's the mean. So if you look at these lines, these confidence intervals through the years, and you look at those last 5, notice how they're much smaller in general than a lot of the previous years ones, especially these 2012, 2011, 2010. There were a few years in here, even these ones, where the confidence intervals are just like really wide. I mean, you're going from like 2,500 bears around here to possibly 6,500. Not a very helpful estimation when you're talking about such a large possible range, because the mean is here, but that doesn't mean it actually was that number. It could have been much lower or much higher. And so our goal with submitting with mandatory tooth submission was to shrink that range of estimation so that it would give us a better idea of what the population might be. And the reason why it shrinks is because you're getting a better sample of how that cohort changes through time. If you only have like 30% of your teeth submitted, you might have whole age groups that are just entirely missing from the data. And that makes the model think it either doesn't give the model enough information to actually make an estimation, or it gives the appearance to the model that you're actually missing an entire age cohort. And that means that it wasn't vulnerable to harvest at all. And so that's where that large estimation kind of comes from. That's why we require mandatory tooth submission now. It's really, really key to this model. Not necessarily key to all species that we model populations for, but with this particular model, because it follows age cohorts through time, and because bears are so long-lived, it's really important to just capture the entire sample of what we can get. So
The bigger science picture of bear management, this is what we do in Vermont. What does New Hampshire do something similar? Maine? How do you all get to a point where people like you who can think through this and work through these models are arriving at? Because I know you work with your partners throughout all the other states in the Northeast.
yeah, so this particular model was originally developed for moose in the 1970s because they also have a differential harvest vulnerability where males are more vulnerable to harvest. And it was later applied to bears by a lot of agencies. I'm actually not aware of any other agencies that don't use this specific model, which is called Palahama Frazier model. It's the name of the person who came up with it. But Some of them use it in conjunction with other population modeling methods where they might use it as a comparison, but it's always a main model that they use to estimate their populations. I don't know if there's any other states that
I can't think of any.
that use any other models, but
You know, we work pretty closely with New Hampshire. They use it.
yeah. So because New Hampshire's bears are similar in many ways to our bear population, our model, this PNF model, Palahama Frazier model, is based largely on the model that they use. So certain inputs are very similar. Like you have to put in an estimate of reproduction to get an estimate of cubs produced every year. That input is very similar to New Hampshire, and we're constantly kind of comparing notes on what our model output is compared to theirs. And we do this with other states as well, but because New Hampshire's is so similar, we compare models a lot and what their model outputs are showing. And we've actually been in recent discussion about potentially doing some testing of different inputs, like kind of changing some of the reproductive inputs and some of the harvest inputs and seeing how the model changes its estimate based on that. So New Hampshire, for example, may be seeing a slight change in their reproduction for bears, where they think that that reproductive input that we use, New Hampshire's might actually be increasing. And so that our thought is to kind of put that into our model and see how it changes the output and how the model reacts to that. So yeah, that's just one time to change it.
Yeah, I haven't seen very many bears cross the Connecticut River. But all those that I've seen have been going from New Hampshire to Vermont.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why.
Yeah, there is some interchange of bears from New Hampshire to Vermont for sure.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I mean, their life history, the same issues that we face are very similar enough that we often compare notes, probably with New Hampshire the most, but sometimes Maine as well and other Northeast states.
Yeah.
I also wanted to point out that, so these are the mean estimates and then these are the max and min confidence intervals. But these dotted green lines here are the population goals that, Jackie, you hadn't mentioned this, right?
I didn't, I forgot to.
So I don't know if you can see that they're green, but they're dotted. So this single dotted line here is the population goal that was 4,500 to 6,000 here. And that was our population goal for a long time until we did the big game management plan and we started discussing the public survey that indicated that people in Vermont were satisfied with the number of bears that they were seeing. That public survey was conducted here, I believe, in that year, 2018, or it would have been here.
Yeah, somewhere in that range. Yeah.
So if you look at the estimate in these years, people are satisfied with this number of bear. That's right around 5,000, probably, 4,200 to 5,700 was the estimate then. And so it wasn't here, it was down here. And so we started thinking about that number. Well, what is that number right now currently, based on what people are responding to the survey from? And we said, well, our top estimate right now is 6,000. And so that is way above what Vermonters indicated they would be comfortable with bears. So that was one aspect of the decision to just slightly lower that by 500 bears to 5,500. And we extended it down to 3,500 bears to make that range 2,000, because this range is 1,500, which is just weird as a number for statistics. It's a strange number to work with. And obviously it doesn't work very well with the model, because if you look at even some of the smallest confidence intervals, they're pushing on that, 1,500. So it would always, your confidence intervals will always be overlapping your goals, which is not a good thing to have. So we increased the range and we lowered the top goal just slightly to be more in keeping with what people were seeing on the landscape at the time. And also considering the future for bears, because with climate change, development pressures, conflict, habitat loss. 6,000 might just not be a very easily accomplished goal in terms of the maximum number that the landscape might even be able to harbor in the future. So it kind of was in keeping that Vermont's landscape is changing and it will continue to change. And we have to be realistic about that.
Now, remember back when Katie, you were involved when Nick gave his population deer pop, dog pop, I mean, he gave them. So Nick uses like one key model, but he has two others. He has three that he runs.
Yeah.
To kind of make sure that deer population estimate is there. I would argue much simpler than this one, because I know when I read the papers, these papers are losing me. I could follow Nick, but they're a little simpler statistics, but very different. This model is compared to the deer. So all these different species, we've got to use different techniques to get at how we're going to estimate the population or monitor it, or try to monitor their carrying capacity, the health of the critters. But so is that right? I mean, he used three different ones, I think, on the deer.
Yeah, he uses three different ones, and that relates to the type of data that he receives from deer harvest. So he is not able to model the does in the same way that he's able to model. So one of his models is just modeling the buck population, and then another one is estimating the doe population. It's completely different because he's also dealing with 20,000 samples or tens of thousands of samples, and we have hundreds of samples for the harvest. And when you're talking about such a complex model where it needs input from every age of every sex, then a few hundred is, even if you start getting at the more recent harvest numbers, which is 500, 600, 700, it's still not a huge number. And so we do intend to compare this model output to another model called a Downing population estimation. Same sort of concept. It builds back the population using ages, but it's a different model. So we want to see how well it follows this trend, because that's usually what we're focused on. We don't really look at single year estimates, which, by the way, aren't even single year estimates for the bears, because we have to, each one of these estimates is based on 5 years prior. So like that year and then the 4 years before it. It's all those age distributions are kind of mushed together in the model, because otherwise it doesn't have enough of the sample size to produce an estimate with 1 year of data. So what we do is we don't necessarily look at single year estimates. We're really focused on that trend, similar to what you heard from next year presentations. We're really focused on that trend. And so our aim eventually is to run that other model as a comparison and see if the trend follows it, or if it kind of separates from it at any point, and try to figure that out and see if it's this model that's not quite capturing the population, or if it's the other model that's not quite capturing the population. Or maybe, like New Hampshire has already done with their comparing of models, they both capture the population pretty well. So yeah, more work to be done with this. There's always more work to be done with statistics, but definitely some improvements have been made, and we're still planning on looking into more things like reproduction and comparing to other models and things like that. So
cool, thank you, Katie. And so another point to the population model is that that's statewide. So, I guess I should say too, that most recent year is actually for 2021. We're always kind of 1 year behind with the model as well. So, in 2021, the mean was showing us just shy of 6,000 bears statewide. And so this is not a perfect way to show you what our current distribution of bears is, but it just gives you a sense of it at least. In 1989, we were still dealing with kind of the relics of European colonization of Vermont. Our bear population was still kind of considered primarily in the Green Mountains and the Northeast Kingdom. But by '89, we were starting to see a spread into the valleys and into more developed and places that still had a decent amount of agriculture. And then this yellow map is the harvest from 2020. And this is, again, just to show you, bears are basically being taken all throughout the Connecticut River Valley, good chunks of the Champlain Valley. And so it's just to kind of show like our distribution of bears had changed, and we now basically have bears everywhere in the state outside of the island of Lake Champlain.
Oh, Jackie,
Yeah.
can I just interject
Yeah.
here? If you go back a slide, what's kind of neat here is that what gives us confidence in this model is not only that we're seeing bears expand their range beyond indicative of like them using up habitat and dispersing into new areas, thus their numbers are going up. But what's cool here too is that you can see it kind of, it goes up and down. Well, that's the model being very good at following beech nut production. So food sources, this is all a reflection of how motivated bears are by food to a point where it actually is reflected in the population estimation. So again, that's why we're pretty confident in this model that it really does reflect what we're seeing in expansion of habitat and then also in just the food production cycle. So
Yeah.
it's pretty cool.
And another reason we also, like he said, we can't focus on just 1 year. We really have to be a little bit patient with this data and try to look at it big picture holistically. And then here's what our harvest has looked like. So starting in 68 up until last year, 2021. And this is broken down by the blue represents bears taken with the use of dogs, and then the red is all the rest of the bears taken. And so you can see we've also had this relatively steady increase. The yellow line kind of gives, it's a rolling 10-year average of the harvest. And so you can see every 10 years that keeps chunking up as well. And yeah, so that's kind of what that data looks like. And again, seems to be tracking with this kind of increase in our bear population.
Did the bears taken with dogs increase accordingly in those last few years as the total take increase? I can't see.
I know.
You can probably move that little box. You just move that black box. I don't know if you can, but you probably can. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it has, and it tends to be, it fluctuates anywhere from like 12 to maybe 16, 18% of the harvest is made up by dogs. And it kind of fluctuates around, I don't know what happened in 2002. There was no breakdown in the data for that year, but yeah.
When did they change the season? Then they had, used to be just they added a second season or changed something in the season there with bear hunting.
That was 2013 was when the early season was
Early,
added.
yes.
Yeah, yeah. But that didn't seem to really, yeah.
But the percentage things stay the same, with from the bear hunters that take bear by dogs over dogs.
Yeah.
Which actually, and we've actually tried to have a lot more communications with the Bear Hunt Association to take more bears. Because we've been concerned a little bit that the number of bears were going beyond our goal. Most of them will not take a bear. That's so we're, but I will say thankfully, somehow people have caught on to more bear hunting opportunities and are harvesting bears. It's not happening from the people with dogs. They more or less love to chase the bear, the dogs, instead of harvesting the bear. But it's interesting. I know Frost went several times and asked them would they shoot more bears because he was concerned about how fast the numbers are going up. But
Yeah, it's kind of not part of, I guess, what's motivating them.
no.
I clicked on that.
I have a question on the breeding.
Yeah.
Are black bears similar to grizzlies, or where the males can become aggressive towards cubs, killing cubs to induce female into estrus?
That's a theory, and it's not something I've seen personally or heard a lot of biologists who reported it directly, but it does seem to be true to an extent. Sows with cubs of the year are the most risk averse. They're very cautious for the most part. That can be learned out of them as well. But and we think a big motivation of that, and they're trying to avoid going into big food sources when more dominant bears are there, especially males. And the theory is that because the males could kill the cubs. And then, of course, there's other theories about this whole mixed paternity thing. You know, these bears do seem to know each other as individuals to some extent. And so maybe that's this other evolutionary motivation behind why they are breeding with multiple males. But it's all stuff that's pretty hard for us to know for sure. But it is a theory, yeah. And then with the bear dog regulations, like I mentioned before, in 2017, we kind of readjusted those. And Jason kind of spoke to this a little bit when he was talking about the coyote dog hunting. You know, with bears, we do have a special permit that's required. No more than 6 dogs are allowed per hunt. We delayed the non-resident bear hound hunting season to start on September 15th instead of September 1st. The training season starts June 1st. And at that time, we also changed the regulation that all hunters, no matter the hunting method, needed to field dress their bear before bringing it into the check station. And that was, again, to really maintain the, you know, the ability to use the meat from those animals, and not to get too focused on setting records with harvesting big, heavy bears. And then just to put us into perspective with what's going on regionally, this is a figure that was generated actually from Florida based on one of our like regional working group meetings. This is from 2018, so it's actually a little outdated. Missouri now does have a bear hunting season. But, you know, more than half of the states and provinces in the East do have hunting seasons for bears. Florida kind of fluctuates between having a season or not. But pretty much, I think Connecticut's kind of the only outlier where they do have a pretty robust bear population without a hunting season. Most of the other places that don't have a hunting season just don't have, you know, a long established bear population. Now we will shift into the coexistence program.
I just got a question for you. Age of bears, what are you seeing as far as the ages of bears harvested? And
Yeah, you know, again, I'm still kind of getting new to looking at all this data. Like Mark said, I've really only been in the pool since last September. But we do, correct me if I'm wrong here, we have been seeing a little bit of a drop in some of the older age classes. Is that correct? Am I making that up?
It's not significant,
Yeah.
and it's not what I would call like a trend yet. The distribution of ages, or the mean age of harvest for males and females, was the same, like remarkably the same for many, many, many years. And we're not sure if the recent change is, I mean, it's not statistically significant either. So it's, you know, the average dipped slightly.
what's an average bear age? You know, 8, 10, 6?
Well, for males, it's lower than for females, because like I described with the cohort, you know, the males get taken out first because they're preferentially targeted. So I think for males, it's like,
Can't even remember off the top.
I know for females, it's like 8 or something. It's much higher than males, and for males, it might be 5 or something. 5 point something is what I remember.
So we
Don't
can
quote
get
me on
that.
that.
Yeah, we could get that.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, again, this is coming from harvest data, so it could be skewed a little young because, of course, those younger individuals are a little more naive, and maybe taken a little bit at higher quantities than, say, an adult male that does make it to 10. And, you know, he may have learned some skills to kind of keep him safer. You know, some research has shown like more mature males will still be accessing risky food sources, but they're the ones coming in at night. And you see that in Maine where they have baiting, like those big males, they're coming in at night when the hunters aren't there anymore. So there's some complexity that plays into that for sure.
Yeah, and the males tend to have bigger home ranges, so they tend to just move a whole lot more than females, and so they're more vulnerable to harvest for that reason as well.
Yep.
How many, early season tags are you selling?
Gosh, that's a great question, too, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but we have, if I remember correctly, yeah. We have seen that increasing since I think 2020, we've seen a slight increase, if I remember correctly. And that first year, it was like, well, maybe this is related to the pandemic. But I feel like it's been maintained.
I think we're around 13,000.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's,
without looking it up. I usually have those in my talking points, but I think what happened, the pandemic, we saw a jump up as we did all licenses. Now it's come back down a little bit, but way more than we anticipated. I think we anticipated 5,000-6,000 we started, then all of a sudden, so it's been consistently high.
yeah. And I don't think the early season tag had come down all that much since
No,
2020.
no, it
Yeah,
hasn't. It hasn't. Probably not.
yeah. And there's a few factors why that could be, it could be more people took it up and realized, oh, I like doing this. I wonder too, if, again, conflicts have been on the rise the last few years, and that gets some people motivated to take up bear hunting as well.
I think the education efforts in the department's help too, to educate people of the quality of bear meat that it is. It's good to eat, it's tasty, how you prepare it. And I think a lot of you that have grown up, probably my similar age, you would never think of eating a bear. Now you would rather have a bear than a deer. It just so and that's the reason we know from the surveys why people hunt bear. They love the quality of the meat that they get from a bear. I'm like, I've got to think something's gone there with our constant messaging, running bear hunting seminars, and from encouraging people to, there's an opportunity for you, and it helps meet our management goals.
Yeah, you have, like a breakdown between archery and firearm?
We do.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jack. I'll see if I got some of these
Yeah.
figures for you. Like I have them in my notes.
remind us to bring that back up if I forget. So again, the reason behind conflicts with bears, it's again primarily food driven. And so these bears are coming into close proximity with people looking for alternative food sources. Big driver can just be a lack of natural food availability. Again, a lot of those plants that produce the foods they need, like I said, some of them naturally fluctuate, but others, if we have drought conditions, late frost, too much rain, it could impact crop conditions for some of those wild foods. Bears being a flexible, opportunistic omnivore, they're always curious to find new foods. And whether it's that curiosity or that lack of natural food, once they start finding our human foods, it can eventually lead them to learn and change their behavior and become what we call food conditioned, which is where they start turning to human foods as a regular part of their diet, and habituation, which means a bear who may have started off being really nervous around people and trying to avoid people, learning that, no, this isn't so risky, and becoming much more comfortable looking for food in close proximity to people. And so what we've seen, just move this, is that we've been seeing the number of reported conflicts to us increase. And so really over the past, 4 years, we've been seeing a pretty big jump in the reports of conflicts. And if you think about that roughly 10-year period that I was talking about, where we feel like our bear population has been stable, the first 5 or 6 years in the past decade, we were averaging like 230 reports of bear conflicts a year. Now we're averaging like 750 reports of conflicts a year. This math is a little bit outdated. I think it was last updated in 2019. But again, it's just showing you, we're receiving reports of bear conflicts throughout the state with a real kind of hot spots associated with some of our resort communities and some of our more residential communities in the state. Along with this, we are seeing an increase in incidentally killed bears. So those are bears killed outside of the hunting season, either directly in conflict situations, being struck and hit by vehicles on our roads. And so, roadkill is the biggest cause of these deaths. We're averaging like 160-ish a year. But again, a handful of these are killed every year, either sadly by our wardens to protect human safety, or by landowners or residents of Vermont directly to either protect their own safety or their property. And like I said, we are seeing fluctuations in our bear population, but over this time period, it has been relatively in the same ballpark of this 4,500 to 6,500 bears. We are currently kind of at that peak high point of where it's been in the past decade. But that doesn't fully explain why we've been seeing such a steady increase. It's not, the number of bears is definitely influencing this, but it's not the only factor influencing this. And so we really feel like people need to start understanding steps they should take to better coexist with bears. And so outreach has been our real focus on trying to tackle this issue. And so through outreach, we're doing lots of media interviews. We're putting a lot of information on social media. We have a really extensive Living with Black Bears website with lots of different web pages with information for folks. I would say some of the best outreach we're doing is like the one-on-one technical advice that's being done by our wardens and by a handful of us in the outreach program and that work on the bear program. And a big part of this is that we're really trying to get people to contact us if they're having an issue with bears in their backyard or in their community. And so they can do that by calling their warden directly, and that warden will have a conversation with them over the phone on steps they can take, or we'll go and do a site visit with them. They can also submit a report to us through our website. Every report that comes into us, one of us will send them a very detailed email with steps that they can take, or give them a phone call, or do a site visit with them. And so through this broad-based outreach through social media, through local media outlets, and then this one-on-one assistance, we're really hoping to just broaden people's understanding of bear behavior, and that these problems aren't going to go away unless we as individuals do something about it. And as of, the 12th, we had received around 864 reports through that website from 173 different towns. I mean, this number every day it goes up. And our wardens, I think at that point, have handled at least 250 calls as well.
Would it be helpful in keeping track of your numbers for me to report a past incident, or does it not matter?
And probably, well, you mean past within this year? Or
Yeah.
You mean, if it happened this year, definitely. Yeah,
I don't need help resolving it.
and you can even put that in, because there's a spot where you can put in your comment. And you can just letting
Just
you know,
reporting.
I've already figured this out, but, because it does, this information, that we get through this helps us understand what are the conflicts that are going on, where are the weaknesses in the information we're sharing, or where do we need to focus our education? And so what we learned from that data coming in is that, not surprisingly, garbage is the #1 reason that's drawn bears into our backyards and into our communities, followed by birdseed. We know that compost and chickens, even though they're not the top 2 causes, they're an increasing source of conflicts in the state. Beehives are just kind of staying steady. They're always an issue. And then corn and orchards are kind of this other subset that typically the wardens handle the majority of those. And since I have your attention, I'll just briefly go through what our checking points for each of those are in the spirit of getting this information out.
Can I just say something? I think that's obvious, but just is that, the information you're gathering from the interactions, you know, whether it's bird feed or whatever's causing the interactions. You're using that information to develop more of an outreach and a training program on how to avoid those interactions. You're not gathering that information for the purpose of trying to calculate how many bears exist in Sawsville. I think that's something that I see on a lot of the training that you do and get posted on online. Is that some people think you're using that information for an alternative motive, which I think is very unfortunate. And there's also comments that say, don't report them.
Yeah.
Because Fish and Wildlife Department is going to use that information for this purpose instead of this. So I think the more you can get that out there, I think the more beneficial will be to the bear population. So
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's something we have, myself and Outreach have been working on, and we've actually revamped, working with IT to revamp even just the reporting form itself so that that's, we list off at the top of it, this is what this information is being used for. You know, my grand vision with this data too is to then be able to share it with communities so that especially some of these community hotspots can like look at this data and be like, okay, how can we tackle this, you know, from the town level as well too. But yeah, it is a good point. There is a lot of like misunderstanding around it and yeah. So yeah, the bird feeder situation, in theory, it should be simple to fix, but it's not. We strongly recommend that people don't put out bird feeders spring, summer, and fall. When they know bears are active, don't put them out. You hear a neighbor in March say, hey, bears is getting my bird feeder, take them in. This is really hard for a lot of people though. People love watching birds. So this year we've been trying to kind of plug this really cool program that Audubon has where you can attract birds with natural plants or native plants instead. Not quite the same, but we're trying to offer like an alternative to people instead of putting out a bird feeder. Garbage, like I said, is the #1 problem. It's a much trickier issue to deal with, but there's kind of 2 key messages we put out to people, and that is secure storage and odor control. Minimize the smell of your garbage, which is hard, but disposing of it as frequently as you can, freezing really smelly scraps until you can get to your dump, or using ammonia to help kind of minimize the enticing smells. And then bear-proof garbage cans, they're expensive, but we do recommend them. We also have instructions on our website of how people can like make their own kind of bear-resistant garbage can, and then, you know, giving people information of the types of spaces to store their garbage in, like a garage, basement, or a shed. Making sure if you do keep it in your garbage, you need to close and lock your doors. Dumpsters are a big sore spot right now too, because we can offer all sorts of advice, but currently most of our dumpster providers don't have bear-proof dumpsters as an option. So that's another big picture thing we need to work with them on. But we do have like modifications we can give to people who don't have access to a bear-proof dumpster. Compost, similar to garbage. I would say garbage, secure storage is the most important part. With compost, odor control is the most important part. If you're composting properly, it shouldn't be putting off much of an odor. So we're really trying to educate people on that proper composting recipe, and then encouraging people to actually get some sturdy tumblers, not just do open pit composting. Or don't compost at home if you've got bears active in your neighborhood. Bees and chickens, electric fencing. This is still a big hurdle. You know, backyard chickens were already popular, but have become more popular since the pandemic. And so really trying to get people to understand that when you go out and buy those chicks, you also need to be buying an electric fence kit along with them. And then giving them advice on how to set those electric fences with bears in mind, because there are some specific settings that are required. And then, like I said, the corn and orchards are another big challenge. This picture here is an aerial shot of a cornfield that is being hit by a bear. So you can see the kind of alien crop circles, that classic bear feeding in corn. You know, we don't have great data on this, but, you know, with that Deerfield study, we did see we saw a number of individuals, always males. We actually never had any of our females go into corn, but we know females do this. But we saw some males, like, over the course of their life, or while we were monitoring them, start like not do it, and then they would do it 1 year, and then boom, they just would start doing it every year after that. And so, you know, my predecessor, Forrest Hammond, worked with one corn farmer, and law enforcement worked with him as well, setting up electric fencing around certain cornfields. And if the cornfields are small enough, it's an option, but it's pretty financially and logistically challenging. So it's not realistic for most corn farmers. Bear dogs is another option that we offer to farmers and orchard operators. They can be effective at minimizing damage, but they're not going to eliminate damage. But right now, electric fencing in some spots, and then hounds where it's actually safe to use them, are really the only two options we have right now for farmers. And in conclusion, you know, I guess kind of the core mantra of the bear program right now is this saying, keep Vermont bears wild. And that's really our focus. And that involves everything I've just talked about, you know, maintaining good habitat for bears so that they have space and the natural foods that they need. Again, promoting coexistence strategies and getting Vermonters to understand that, like, this needs to just be a way of life if we want to continue to live alongside these animals. And then again, creating opportunities for people to connect with bears, whether that be through hunting, getting involved in habitat conservation, or getting involved with promoting coexistence in their communities, but allowing Vermonters to feel, connected in a positive way to these animals.
Jackie, I just wanted to add something really quickly, just to emphasize. I mean, this presentation is long because bears are so complex and difficult in many ways to manage. But I wanted to highlight the huge improvements that we've all accomplished. Jackie and her predecessor Frost have accomplished in the bear program in recent years. And Jay, I think you had asked the question about age, right? So I looked it up and it reminded me of some other improvements that we did because we got this model essentially from New Hampshire before I came. It was basically just that the data had to be farmed out to someone out of state to run the model because it is that complex. There was just no other way of doing it. And in so doing, there was a lot of data that kind of got mixed around. And that resulted in, yes, like with the old data, the age was showing it was reducing. But after I came and really looked at it, there was some reshuffling of data to make it more accurate. And after we had addressed those, I'll call them errors, then the age didn't show a reduction for females. And in fact, it showed us even more confidence in the models because the male age was actually showing a significant decreasing trend just by like a year. But what showed us with that was that it was really highly correlated with the number of harvested bears. So as more males got harvested, their age went down, which shows that males are more vulnerable to harvest. So those younger bears get taken out even more, and that age sort of dips down a little bit more, which gives us real confidence in that model because that's what the model is based on, is differential harvest vulnerability. So that was a huge improvement that we had, where it was like an aha moment of great. We really have good data now, and it's showing it through our results. So.
Simple numbers for you there. We asked about archery, I think with you, Marty, or so I think in 20 or 21, I can't remember exactly what years, but about 145 bears were taken. And probably about 88 of those are from crossbow and 57 from longbow. So since crossbows became legal to hunt for archery, we've seen that kill continually go up for bears.
How many was that?
So 145.
If you go on,
Let me just, yeah, go ahead. You can go ahead, Jay.
I was gonna say, if you go online, we do have, a harvest report every year. for the
Yeah, I was gonna say,
season.
I was gonna say next we should we'll send it to you.
Yeah,
And the nice thing, if you go on the department too, you'll see the harvest report for all the years. So if you want to track different years, so I find myself going to look at it different times, to remind myself, what year was that? And it's also, but the interesting part of the early season tax, I was close. The number for 21 was 13,028. That's out of a possible 81,319 hunters who could shoot a bear during the November, what we call the second season now. To do that. And that was peaked because of the pandemic. That peaked at 13,866. So it dropped by not quite 1,000, but 800 or so a year later. So we saw that pretty much in all of our hunting license sales. So, but people are signing up for the early season bear hunter harvest. And some years they're taking a significant amount of the harvest. 2 years ago, last year not as high because the people are out there, they're hunting the early. If it's a poor beech nut crop, as Jackie explained here earlier, they go to bed den earlier. The denning is all based on food availability. So years when there's high food availability, you see more bears taken by the second season. People out there deer hunting, taking the opportunity to take a bear as well as a deer when they do. And because of that too, that's why at one point in time, the department only used to set the bear season every single year. We've never seen the law book years ago because we had to really determine what that take was early because we were scared. We didn't think we had enough bears to do it. But it's an interesting how it all really, the harvest, you can't look at 1 year. It ties not only numbers, but just food availability. But now so many people are targeting the early season bears. It's probably taken away our fears. But the number one management effort that we could do if we needed to go to the board to reduce bear numbers or increase them, just like that, is how we change with those season dates in the fall. If we lengthen it, we could see an increase in harvest if it coincided with the low beech nut year. If it wouldn't make a bit of difference how late the season would go if there was a low beech nut year, because the bears wouldn't be there, they'd be dense. It's interesting to see that, but I have to chuckle at Katie's comment. It wasn't that long ago, when I remember back 11, 12 years ago, the board was getting hit very hard by the Bear Hound Association, that they were concerned that the rate we were harvesting bears, we were going to have no more bears left in the state. And they were all over the department. Poor Frost would get beat up terrible at their meetings. They were doing their own statistics. So I literally asked Kent Gustafson, their biometrician in New Hampshire, come over and meet with us. And the chair of the board came and met with us. Brian Ames at the time was the chair. I don't remember the other board member. And we also met with the Bear Hound Association and Frost. And we had the New Hampshire bear biologist, their biometrician, walk through to assure the Bear Hound Association people and the board we were not overkilling their bears. Because they were doing the data analysis for us. We couldn't do it. We didn't have the sophistication that we have now to do it ourselves. But it's ironic because I see those people now and they never mentioned to me that we were going to wipe out the bears.
some of them still call, but.
They don't tell you we're going to wipe them out. We'll wipe out all the big bears. That's what they say now. They changed their plan, but it is interesting. It's not a simple science as what you look at harvest and things on an animal like this. It's complex. And will we please everybody? No.
One quick question. So it's great to have a presentation like this and not hear the word tick at all.
Yeah, bears are pretty healthy. There are some diseases and parasites they deal with. They do carry ticks occasionally, but yeah, they're good groomers. So.
That's very informative. Thank you.
Very well. Okay. Let's see, we have one item left on the agenda. We have commissioners' updates.
Mine's about as long as that presentation, so.
Noted.
So you see what I mean, when I introduced Jackie and I didn't mention the other staff at the time, but I'm blessed to go to work with people like this every day. I will be brief. Been a fairly active summer for me. What I've tried to do is get out and visit people. Because once the hunting season starts and the legislative session gets into full swing, I'm kind of tied up. And so I've been doing some field visits. I actually spent some time with Jackie and one of the wardens and the secretary. And we went out to some sites in Barry where there's been bear conflict. And one of the sites I won't mention has 3, 4, maybe 5 bears coming down on a regular basis. There are pictures. And we actually spent time with the manager of the facility. I spent time, I didn't tell him anything, but Jackie and the warden were giving great advice on potentially what to do. And so it was really informative for me, but just another reminder of the great work the staff do. The wardens, you know, they are community policing. I was impressed in the way Dustin interacted with folks. That wasn't the only place that we saw people. And so it was really good work. It was fun for me to get out of the bin. I went out with the on the dory, which is our boat, and went gill netting with our fish biologists. And contrary to my experience, we caught a lot of fish. I didn't know there were actually fish in the lake, but we caught a lot of lake trout and a bunch of others. And we had a professor from UVM who was doing a study on the lake trout and what they are eating. And we're looking at, I don't think I'm getting ahead of my folks on this. If I am, I'll hear about it. But looking at the balance between the lake trout that we put in the lake from the fish hatcheries to naturally breeding lake trout. And maybe we need to recalibrate what we're doing because the natural lake trout are doing a pretty good job reproducing. That was fun. And then maybe the coolest, well, don't take this wrong. One of the coolest things I did was a couple Mondays ago, I went out with our small mammal biologist and we captured little brown bats. And they are, in fact, little brown bats. They weigh somewhere in the order of 6 to 9 grams, which is teeny tiny, but they eat that amount every night when they're flying around, which makes me happy because I'm not a fan of the mosquito. We captured about 50 of them and they were all processed, or 30 of them were processed for a study being done at the University of Virginia. They swabbed their little mouths and they're testing for SARS-CoV-2. I actually think they were testing for something else, but when they looked at the bats' wings, they could see if they had survived the white nose disease, and many of them had it. I forget the percentage, but you could see scarring on the wings, and so that was interesting. And good news, the numbers are trending in the right direction. You were talking about trends earlier, and so that is really good news. I didn't get to go out with them last Wednesday, where they were in Heinsberg, I think. They were capturing the Indiana bat, which also is seeing good numbers. So those are kind of the fun things I get to do. I'm going out on September 8th, and we're going to play with rattlesnakes. So I hate snakes, and I told them that and said, you need to get me over my fear of snakes. So I'm going to go out. I don't know what I got myself into, but that'll be fun. The other things we've covered mostly tonight is the 2 bills that passed the legislature has occupied a great deal of time at the department, getting us to the point where we are now and projecting out. The other thing we are doing is looking at what do we want to propose coming into the legislative session in January. And so we're working internally on that. And it's a little premature to even give you any kind of heads up on what that might look like. But yeah, all the directors are working together and with me to look at possible proposals. And then the last thing is next week, we'll have an interview panel because as you know, the colonel is retiring. And so I do have to replace him. Is irreplaceable as he is. And so I don't know, is this going to be your last meeting?
No, sir, I had one more.
Okay, so bear that in mind, folks, as well. We'll probably roast him at the next meeting. I will say, and I'll talk more about it then, by that meeting, we will be able to announce, hopefully, who the next colonel will be, because I'd like them to work together for some time, because it is such a complex job. And Jason has just done a phenomenal job. And so I mean it, it'll be hard to replace him. And I know where he's gonna live, so he won't be too far away. Maybe we'll activate the Kim Royer clause with Jason. So, and that's really all I've got unless folks have questions.
Questions for the commissioner? Okay, if not, we'll go around the table. If anybody has any general comments, do around the table. Dave, want to go first?
Two